Hello, this is Dr. Muhammad Sajidul Islam, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. Today I am here to talk about T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and Individual Talent. T.S. Eliot is a very famous and towering figure in literary criticism and poetry of the modern period. This essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, was first published in 1919 in Times Literary Supplement, and it is considered the unofficial manifesto of Eliot's critical creed. It forms the basis of all his subsequent criticism. This essay has three parts. The first part deals with the concept of tradition. The second part deals with the theory of the impersonality of poetry. The third part sums up the whole discussion. Eliot's concept of tradition. According to Eliot, tradition is not the slavish imitation of the past. Tradition cannot be inherited. It can only be obtained by hard labor. Tradition can only be obtained by those who have the historical sense. Historical sense involves the perception not only of the pastness of the past, but also of its presence. One who has the historical sense feels that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer to his own day, including the literature of his own country, forms one continuous literary tradition. That is to say, the poet has to work hard, labor hard, and read the whole tradition and keep in mind the trends of the different era before composing his own poetry. Eliot's conception of tradition is a dynamic one. It is not something fixed. It is constantly changing, growing, and becoming different from what it is. The relationship between the past and the present is a reciprocal one. Just as the past directs and guides the present, so the present alters and modifies the past. When there is a new creation of literature, it affects the existing ones and it takes its place in the whole scheme of things, and it also affects the interpretation of the existing works of literature. A writer must seek guidance from the past and conform to the literary tradition. The theory of impersonality of poetry. The poet, according to Eliot, must be as impersonal as a scientist. The emotions and passions of a poet must be depersonalized before it enters into the poetry. Eliot says, the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. That is, the poet deals with different emotions and feelings that can be his personal emotions and feelings, or it can be experienced by him in some other ways. But these two things should be very, very separate. The emotions and feelings might be in his personality, but the mind that engages in the creation of poetry, that should not be affected by his personal emotions and feelings. That is, it should be completely separate. The personality of the poet is a mere receptacle. Eliot says it is just like a catalyst in a chemical reaction. That is a kind of receptacle where the emotions are collected and takes the form of poetry after refinement. Eliot says honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet but upon the poetry. That is, the job of a critic is not to criticize the personality of the poet but the poem as such. Eliot's conception of poetry. Poetry, according to Eliot, is organization rather than inspiration. Eliot does not believe in the theory of inspiration, that is, the poet should be inspired to write. He rather believes that it is more of organization. The greatness of a poem depends upon the intensity of the process of poetic composition, which is a hard labor. The emotion of poetry is different from the personal emotion of the poet. Again, here his idea of the impersonality of poetry comes alive. The emotion of the poet does not enter into his poetry directly or as it was. The emotion of poetry must be complex and refined. The emotion that a poet might have felt in his personal life or might have experienced in some other ways cannot enter into poetry as it is. It must be refined and had to be made complex. Even the emotions which the poet has never personally experienced can serve the purpose of poetry. Eliot concludes his essay by saying that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. This essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, forms the basis of Eliot's critical creed and his classicism. He encourages and he gives a great responsibility upon the poet, that a poet cannot create or compose his poetry in isolation. He has to take into consideration the existing train right from the classical age, and it is not something that will be read and interpreted in isolation. Thank you.